Hi everyone, this is Jason Burack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's very special guest is a personal hero of mine. It's legendary investor and author Jim Rogers. Jim, thank you so much for joining me on a podcast today from Singapore.
I'm delighted to be here, Jason.
Thank you, Jim. Let's jump right in here with my first question, and it pertains to capitalism. Do you think corrupt politicians, bureaucrats, anti-business academics, and central bankers are killing capitalism?
Well, yes and no. It depends on which country you're talking about. Certainly in the United States, we don't have as free a market as we used to have. Other parts of the world, though, some of the Asian countries are opening up more and becoming more and more capitalistic, while America's going the other way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment, and especially in the elections here in the United States and also in Europe, you just have this rhetoric. Like in France, I think they raised taxes, to the 75% of personal income, and then here in the United States, there's a lot of people, a lot of Americans who don't even know what capitalism is. I don't even think they're taught it in schools anymore.
Well, if they're taught, you're right. They more or less, most people these days, but not just in the U.S., most people in the world listen to the government. If the government says the sky is blue, they don't even look out the window. They just assume the sky is blue. Why else would the government say it? So I think it's more that we don't question. Most people don't question what they're told, especially by their government. I think in the old days we did, but we don't seem to anymore. By the way, I should alert you, I'm on my bicycle, so if you hear me huffing and puffing, I hope I'm not having a heart attack. It's just that I'm exercising. So go ahead.
Great. I think our listeners are just happy to even have you answer the questions. So do you think then, on the current pace it's on, can capitalism in the Western world, here in the U.S. and Europe, do you think it can survive, or do you think it's going to be terminal?
Well, capitalism as we know it, certainly in the United States, is terminal. We're going the way that the UK went. There are many great empires or great nations go. Unfortunately, throughout history, great nations have developed in a real sort of, I'm going to say, free market or open society, if you will, where everybody just does what they want to, and the government is usually not terribly involved. Then, or even if the government is involved, they become less and less involved, and you have societies and economies open and thrive. But then there comes a time when everything gets mature, to use that, let's say mature, and then the government starts getting more involved because people start looking for a free lunch. When things go wrong, people say, "Oh gosh, help me, save me." And they look to the government to save them. And then governments become more and more controlling. I once read, I haven't seen the study myself, but that all great nations, when they reach the pinnacle, start trying to control more and more things and more of people's lives as a way to prevent decline. Of course, that just accelerates decline when it happens. But that's what's happening in the U.S. We have certainly matured. There are those who say we're in decline, and as we decline, we're trying to control more and more of people's lives, which accelerates the declines. But you keep talking about the West. I mean, there's some nations that are going, Estonia, Latvia, Bulgaria, some of these old communist nations are doing quite the opposite. Georgia are doing quite the opposite. They're opening up, throwing off the shackles of too many controls, too much government, and doing the opposite. So again, I cannot make sweeping generalizations.
Very, very good. And these countries that you talked about, where now they have freer markets, I mean, they made an experiment. They went all the way to totalitarianism, and they were using the full Keynesian playbook, and now they've learned from their errors, I guess, and they're back to letting the private sector do its thing.
Or just getting out of the way. If you have a weak government, and I don't mean weak in a pejorative sense, just a not very developed government, then the government doesn't get in the way because there's nobody to get in the way. They don't think about it. So that's partly what's happening in some places. Some of the African countries, for instance, which are now starting to open up and thrive, it's mainly because the government is just too, not non-existent, but it's just not organized and developed enough to get in the way.
Very good. And one of those main instruments of intervention is Keynesian economics. Why do you think Keynesian economics has endured for so long and continues to be the only economic theory taught by almost every major university in the world, despite its historically poor track record?
It does have a poor track record, that's for sure. It's mainly because that was what was taught in the 30s in the U.S. and in the U.K., as people were looking for a handout or a lifeline, and people started teaching Keynesianism as the government intervened more and more, and obviously anybody who was a professor then or a student was subsequently brought up on Keynesian economics.
Yeah, and I think also, after World War II, post-World War II, when the U.S. came back, the U.S. had the advantage of having the only manufacturing base that wasn't basically bombed out. And the Keynesians take a lot of and the Keynesians, after World War II, and the U.S.'s manufacturing base was the only one really left standing. And then the soldiers came back and they started having babies, and the U.S.'s economy flourished from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the Keynesians just took credit for something that was really none of their business, Jim. So do you agree with that?
Well, yes. As I had said, Keynesians. Keynes was very well known in the UK and therefore in the US, since the UK dominated the English-speaking press in those days after the empire worldwide. And so that's what professors knew and government officials knew, and it sounded very plausible. So yes, they took credit. The real credit, of course, was for 15 years, the world had been forced to save huge amounts of money because of the Repression and the war, and eventually they started spending that money. We came out of the 30s and 40s with lots and lots of savings worldwide, but especially in the U.S., huge amounts of savings in the U.S., and we started, after investing it, and we started spending it and consuming. So it was pretty simple economics what happened. It wasn't Keynesianism that saved us. Unfortunately, it was historic circumstances.
Yes, I completely agree, and it's, letting the private sector do its thing and the government getting out of the way. And unfortunately, the Keynesians take credit for when things go well, and then they blame the free market and capitalism for when things go bad.
Well, yes, that's pretty much, that's politicians as well. You always want to blame somebody, and it's easier to blame evil capitalists, evil financiers, evil foreigners, than it is to face reality.
Okay, and I want to ask you then about the Austrian School of Economics, and how much has reading and learning, the Austrian School of Economics and the work of von Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, and the other Austrian economists help you gain an advantage investing in the markets as well as in other endeavors in life?
Well, I don't know that it's helped me at all. I figured out somehow or another before I'd ever heard of any of these guys the way the world worked, the reality of the world, and I think that's what helped more than anything else. Just observing the world, seeing reality, and then using reality as my approach. I mean, trees don't grow to the sky. That's pretty simple stuff. You don't have to be a Keynesian or an Austrian to know that, although many people succumb. And if enough people say trees grow to the sky, they believe it. So it's really...
And the Keynesians can make a model for it, too.
Well, and the Keynesians can certainly demonstrate that if trees don't grow to the sky, we can help trees grow to the sky, and we'll all be better off. At least the guys you mentioned accept the fact that trees don't grow to the sky, and there's really nothing we should do about it, can do about it, so we should just let nature take its course. Some trees die. Some trees fall apart. Nothing wrong with that. It's just the way the world works. Well, I observed that. I guess partly because I grew up in a small town in Alabama, the backwoods of Alabama, and I went to places where an Ivy League school where people didn't deal in what I thought was reality, having grown up in a place where money was hard to get. And then on Wall Street, I heard some pretty absurd statements that trees could grow to the sky, but most of them had gone to Ivy League schools where they had been taught differently from what I had observed.
Speaking of Wall Street and the markets now, do you see any potential black swan events coming that most of Wall Street and the mainstream media are not aware of?
Well, there are always, throughout history, there are always things that people have not thought about. Usually some people have thought through what's going on. I mean, there were people who saw that housing had to collapse, that housing finance had to collapse. Was that a black swan event, to use your term? Not in my view, because there were people who knew it was coming. So there's always somebody. There's going to be a war again. I don't know when or where. I guess some will say it's a black swan event, although some will figure it out in advance and take action. No, I don't think. I guess maybe some kind of huge earthquake could be considered a black swan event, which none of us will anticipate. Although if you look at the world, we know that California is going to have a collapse eventually. I don't know when. Maybe somebody does. We know that there are huge problems taking place in the South Pacific, seismic problems, that I don't know if it's going to erupt this year or this century. But things like that, I guess, would be considered a surprise to most of us. But again, to say what I said before, we all know there are going to be problems in California, and yet people are still sitting there as though there will never be a problem in California. And when it comes, I'm sure somebody's going to say, we had no way of knowing this could happen. You look at 9/11. Condoleezza Rice said, we had no way of knowing this was coming. Well, that's balderdash, because they had been warned, they had been alerted, etc. So most black swan events have been anticipated by somebody. Maybe they haven't been anticipated by the vast majority of people, but somebody usually sees things that are coming.
And you have a long track record, Jim, of finding those events in the markets and making money, and you have the track record to back it up with your hedge fund, the Quantum Fund. About the macroeconomic situation now, would you agree that the Western world, at least, is in stagflation? And do you see the central planners and the Keynesian economists and the central bankers being able to keep us then in a stagflation?
Well, most of the world certainly is in stagflation now. It's pretty simple stuff just to look around. Some government statistics say it's not, but most of those, you really can't rely on government statistics anymore, if you ever could. Certainly not now. They're going to do their best to keep things propped up, which, of course, in my view is the wrong solution. It just makes it worse, such as the Japanese have demonstrated for 22 years now. They'll try. They'll do their best. It will make the situation worse. The Japanese have had 2 lost decades. We've already had 1 lost decade. I'm sure may have 2 or 3. We, the U.S., now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. So we're not solving our problems. We're making our problems worse. You cannot solve a problem of too much debt and too much consumption with more debt and more consumption, despite what the people in Washington are now saying.
Yeah, this financial repression and this beautiful deleveraging strategy that Ray Dalio wrote a long paper on, and it seems like the Federal Reserve and D.C. want to implement this strategy. I don't think it's going to work either, but I mean, they're going to try to do more and more intervention, I guess, to implement the plan.
Yes, unfortunately, Washington is destroying the group of people who save and invest for the future. They're all being wiped out now, and history shows pretty vividly that when you destroy the people who save and invest for the future, you're pretty much wrecking your society down the road. And that's what we're doing. All the people who didn't buy 4 houses and take on huge debts, who saved their money, anticipating the future, are now being wiped out at the expense of the people who did take on huge debts and didn't live the way you and I would live our lives, those people are now benefiting at the expense of the people who tried to save and prepare for the future.
Very good. And turning to Asia now, since you live in Singapore, from your perspective, how is this Japan-China conflict that seems to be worsening affecting business conditions in Singapore and the rest of Asia?
Well, conditions are slowing everywhere. I guess maybe that's getting some marginal additional effect or getting credit for it. I guess the Chinese aren't buying Japanese cars at the moment. I don't know. Is that going to turn into the next Great War? I hope not. It's pretty absurd if it is, but usually wars have started over pretty absurd things, which politicians then exploit, especially when things are going wrong in their economies. It's always easier to blame, as I said before, evil foreigners, evil financiers, and evil bankers. So it could turn into much worse. But Asia's slowing down anyway. The world's slowing down anyway. Whether those islands suddenly develop into a forgotten thing tomorrow doesn't matter, because the world is slowing down anyway.
Yeah, and I think China has, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think China has basically intentionally slowed down their economy the last 18 or 24 months because the food prices, there was so much inflation and protests on the streets, or is that not right?
No, China's been trying to slow things down for 3 years. They've been pretty public about announcing it. It's the right thing to do, in my view. They have had inflation. They have had a real estate bubble, partly self-imposed, partly their own fault. But at least they recognize it and are trying to do something. Have been trying to do something about it. No, you're exactly right. Anybody who didn't know China's been trying to cool things off hasn't been reading the newspapers or hasn't been paying attention to the media.
Okay. And I have one final question before we start talking about your books and your Government Home Project and your Commodities Index. What career advice would you give to a young, talented, and hardworking 20-something who just graduated college or graduate school and wants to get ahead in life and start saving and investing money, but the economy and unemployment situation in the U.S. is preventing them from finding enough full-time work to start saving and investing?
Well, the only advice I can give anybody, whether they're 20 or 30 or 50, is follow your own passions. That's how you're going to be successful. And if you're not successful, at least you're going to be happy. Trying to do what some guy on the Internet says is a good future is not going to help you. If you hear somebody say, oh, become a dentist, and you hate dentistry, you might do it, but you're never going to be a terribly successful dentist, and you're not going to be happy. So it's better to figure out what your own passions are. The guys who are most successful in life are the people who follow their dreams, no matter how absurd they are. And even if they're not successful, at least they're happy. They never go to work. They just wake up every day and start having fun, no matter how absurd it is. So, but those also are the people who become the most successful ultimately.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because you've said in other interviews how you think farmers and petroleum engineers and geologists are going to be very successful. But if someone has no interest in that, then they're gonna just go through the motions. They're not going to go the extra mile. They're not going to put in the extra time and effort to be the best at their craft.
Well, yes, if you're in a profession where there's a big boom going on, sure, you're going to have some success just by showing up. You know, a lot of life is just showing up, especially if you're at the right place at the right time. But you're not going to be the wildly successful ones. And when the boom ends, you're going to suffer. You're going to be one of the first to go, whatever the boom is.
Great. And can you please tell our listeners about your Government Home Project, and do you think it will help prevent politicians from being as corrupted by lobbyists?
Well, I wrote a book called Investment Biker once, 20-odd years ago, and in there I suggested that one way to maybe help the political process was to prevent politicians going to Washington. You know, we send all of our congressmen and senators to Washington, where they all sit around eating in the same restaurants with the same lobbyists, and while we at home have no idea what's going on, and they have no idea what's going on at home either, because they're all in Washington eating and drinking with each other.
And they also spend none of their time reading the legislation, and they sign things into law they really don't read, and their aides really don't read, and then they spend the majority of their time campaigning for more money.
Well, you're trying to raise more money. You're right. So it just, in the late 18th century, it was understandable. That's where you had to set up a government. Everybody had to gather at one place. How else could you do it? But, if you were setting up a government in 2016, you would not do it this way. You would make use of phones, internet, video cams, everything else, and say, why do we need to go to one central place? Maybe we can go to one central place a few times a year, but we don't need all that. So let's just stay here. I mean, I'm interviewing you right now, several thousand miles, several thousand kilometers away from each other. This can be done now. We could have a conference. We could have a video conference. We could see each other. So there's no really reason to send them to Washington anymore. It takes a huge human toll on the people. But if they stayed home and voted from home, and they went down to the same supermarket and the same school and the same highway that you and I did, the world would be a whole lot different. They could still talk to lobbyists, but it would be much more efficient if all the lobbyists had to go and visit 535 districts instead of what we do now is we send 535 congressmen and senators to one place. The lobbyists know exactly where they are. We just sort of serve them up and say, here they are, lobbyists. Have at them. It'd be a whole lot different if the lobbyists had to come to all of our districts. We would see them eating at restaurants together. We would say to the congressman, who was that? And he would say that was XYZ lobbyist. And we would know what's going on. Right now we have no clue. And neither do the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's some great documentaries for our listeners out there called The Best Government Money Can Buy. And the one about the people in Congress who didn't even sign the bill, Fools on the Hill. That's the other great documentary I strongly suggest our listeners take a look at. In wrapping up the interview, Jim, let's talk about your books before we let you go. Do you have a particular favorite book you wrote and why?
No, I mean, some people, obviously the first book is the first book, and that makes an impression, and mine was called Investment Biker, which I certainly loved and had a wonderful time doing, but then along came Adventure Capitalist, Gift to My Children. I'm publishing a new book now. I guess in February, I'll say my favorite is the new book. It's like if you have a child. Your new child, at least at the moment, is very, very favorable or favorite. But if you look back over your life and you have several children, you love them all, and they're all your favorites. At least in my case, they are.
My favorite book of your books is actually Hot Commodities that you wrote, because that got me interested in investing in commodities, because I worked in financial services for a while and we didn't even learn anything about commodities, and your book was the first guide to me actually learning anything about how to invest or trade in them.
Well, it certainly was and still is pretty much overlooked area of finance. We crank out a couple 100,000 MBAs every year. Most of them still cannot spell commodities. There are very few courses in commodities or natural resources in any business school, because it's been stocks and bonds for the past 30 or 40 years. That's how you find opportunities. You don't go where everybody else goes. You go where everybody else isn't. It doesn't mean that you're going to find an opportunity, but you're more likely to find an opportunity if you go to areas which people are avoiding rather than to areas where everybody's doing the same thing.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's really good to be a contrarian, because, if that stock that you're chasing higher, if the earnings expectations are already very high, and there's 20 or 30 analysts covering the company, then this is probably a lot of the value is already priced into the company, and commodities, like you said, are just ignored. That it's good to find value if you take the time to do your own research.
Well, more and more people can spell commodities now, but there's still very few people who've ever invested in commodities.
Exactly. And as we wrap up the interview, Jim, can you tell our listeners about your Commodities Index? Because I think it's one of the best ways the retail investor can diversify in commodities.
Well, I wanted to invest in commodities when I was setting out on my last trip, but I could not find a decent commodity index. They were all hopeless as far as I was concerned. So I had to come up with my own, which so far has far outperformed the other indexes around the world. It's where I put my money when I invest in commodities. As you know, Jason, many studies have demonstrated that index investing outperforms active management 70 or 80% of the time, year after year after year. So no matter what the asset, most of us are better off investing in indexes. So I came up with this index, invested my own money, and set off around the world. And as you know, or maybe you know, so far it's outperformed nearly all other indexes in the world, stock, bonds, commodities, and everything else. Now,
Jim, you wanted to tell our listeners about your new book that's coming out, so let our listeners know, because I'm sure they're going to be very interested in buying it.
Well, my last book was a gift to my children, and I'm publishing a new book in February called Street Smarts. Let me get it right. Street Smarts, Adventures on the Road and in the Markets. It'll be out early February, published by Crown, which is a division of Random House, and I hope people like it.
Yeah, I can't wait for it to come out, and hopefully it's on audiobook too.
I'm sure it will be eventually. I think all of my books have eventually made it to audiobook.
Yeah, I love audiobooks. You can finish the books in like half the time. Okay, in wrapping things up here, Jim, I just want to thank you so much for coming on in a Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview, and hopefully we can have you back on soon.
Okay, Jason, thank you very, very much. Let's do it again.